Well, hello there, alpha males. Today, an episode spawned of course, everything, the source of all good things is God, but spawned these ideas from the Patreon chat, a special insider chat that you could be a part of if you want to become a patron. Anyway, a lot of times you talk about a lot of Bible verses, a lot of deep theology stuff. Sometimes you talk about guns and ammo and prepping, survivaling, the big boogaloo, whatever you want to call it. When peanut butter and chocolate hits the fan, which is what I like to call it. So, that's what we're going to talk about today on Alpha Male Podcast. The podcast where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, made in the image of God, strong, dominant, in control. And we don't apologize for that, with God at the center. Now, I'll often throw in a bio as it relates to the topic. Today, of course, as it always relates, first and foremost, I am a Christian. I serve God, follow Christ. As far as the episode goes, I eat food. I've eaten food pretty much every day that I've been alive, minus, the fast days. So, yeah, there's that. Anyway, let's get into the topic beyond rice and beans. I think that's where most preppers start, and not specifically rice and beans, but that's a common thing, where you store grain. I know technically bean is not a grain, but come on. You store grains, things easily to store, in buckets. And that makes a lot of sense, right? I think that's a big reason that humans historically cultivated grains like wheat, barley, or whatever, because it stores well, right? You didn't have to worry about starving to death in wintertime when you have that dearth, when you have that lack of food. Well, it makes sense that's where you'd start in the modern day. Also, because they're very affordable in the modern day. Think about what it costs just in ingredients with just a bowl full, a big bowl. The biggest bowl you can think of, a punch bowl full of rice and beans. Think of what you can get that for, even with today's inflation. Think about what that would cost, just a simple bowl of rice and beans. Now think of what you would trade for that bowl of rice and beans if you were starving. Not even starving to death. Let's just say you haven't eaten for 3 days. Have you gone? Let's just say it's your third day without food. What would you trade? What would you trade for that bowl of rice and beans? Right? It's a smart place to start. They store well. And again, not necessarily rice and beans. You could store corn. You could store wheat. You could store all kinds of things. But they're easy to store in that realm. And I think that's where a lot of people start when they get serious about their food storage. It makes a lot of sense. That's not what we're going to talk about today. How about beyond the bean? Beyond the beans and rice. What else might you want to store? And this came out of the Patreon chat. Here's a couple of things. Now, if you don't know, my wife and I live as neo-nomads. We live pretty large chunks off-grid or semi-off-grid. In fact, we're semi-off-grid right now. Off-grid is a sliding scale, right? We may not have grid electricity or grid water, but if we have a generator, is that on-grid? Is that off-grid? If we have a propane heater, am I not totally off-grid because I'm not living like Jeremiah Johnson chopping my own wood? I have done that in the past, but you get it. Off-grid is kind of a sliding scale. Even now we're semi-off-grid. We live as neo-nomads, so this may be a little bit unique, but not really, because a lot of people live in apartments. And in apartments, space can often be important. Like, you don't have a giant garage, a 2-car, 3-car garage probably, if you live in a people hive, to store all this massive amounts of food. You probably don't have a bunker. So some of these tips, although you may not live as a nomad, may really help you. One is Coast Guard rations / survival boat rations. These are literally designed for high density, calorie, balanced diet foods. They're not as cheap as rice and beans, but if space is at a premium, let's say you start and you got a couple of buckets of rice and beans and you're thinking, I don't have a lot of room, even being creative, storing underneath a bed or something like that, for a lot of extra food, and I think things might get bad. I mean, Joseph had to prepare. God chose Joseph, and he had to prepare for 7 lean years, right? If you're trying to stack up the calories, space may be of a major consideration. So those lifeboat, those Coast Guard rations, whatever you want to call them, those are really, really good. You can survive on those. They're survival rations. They're not as cheap as rice and beans, but one, they come in bricks. They're pretty impervious to high swings in temperature and low swings in temperature. and they have the things that your body needs, right? They're fortified with different things, so they're more nutritious than rice and beans. And they don't take up a lot of space, and they have a lot of calories. So you may really look at those. That's the first thing I would tell you to look at. The next, the amazing gift from God, peanut butter. You might think peanut butter is expensive at first, but when you look at it, don't look at it what it costs pound for pound. Look at what you get as far as calories per pound. Look at how many calories a pound of rice, even a pound of beans and rice has. Look at how many calories that has versus how many calories are in peanut butter. It is the more natural version of like Coast Guard survival rations. You got good healthy fat, check. You got protein, check. You got delicious, check. You got I can eat it without having to cook it, check. So, yeah, it's legit. You can get it in giant tubs. You can get it in 5-gallon buckets. I asked one year, I'm a pretty simple person, I got asked what I wanted for my birthday, and I said peanut butter. And I got 90-something pounds of peanut butter for my birthday. It didn't last that long. That's a natural part of my diet, peanut butter. But you can get peanut butter if you want peanut butter in bulk. I'm not sponsored by these guys for sure, but Webstront store, you can get peanut butter in bulk. I'm sure you can get it other places, but peanut butter as a survival food. A lot of times in the survival prep food, you're talking beans and rice, what's really lacking in that is protein and fat. Guess what is really abundant in peanut butter? Protein and fat, baby. So peanut butter, don't overlook it. It's also really calorie dense for its size. So you could store, let's say you have a closet in which to store your survival food. You can store a lot more calories worth of peanut butter in the form of peanut butter than you can in rice and beans. Also, you don't have to cook it. So those are some real good survival options there. Also, talking about doesn't take up a lot of space and don't overlook it, multivitamins. Right? Are you storing vitamins? Probably don't want scurvy in the apocalypse. Especially if you're storing corn, you probably don't want to die from lack of B vitamins. You might want to look up tamalization, or mixed tamalization if you're storing a bunch of corn. But anyway, you need vitamins, and vitamins don't take up a lot of space, and they're pretty cheap. So also the vitamins. Now let's get off of the high density, low space kind of thing. Let's talk about other things you can store. Beans and rice, wheat, the traditional things, they have a few drawbacks. I'm not telling you not to start there. Again, it makes sense to start there, but they have a few drawbacks. They can be pretty energy intensive, labor intensive, or heat intensive, or water intensive, whatever. Labor and resource intensive to actually cook, right? You're not probably just opening up a bucket of rice and beans and eating it. You have to cook it. I was the commander of a tactical team, and a man that I truly love. I consider him a brother. I made him one of the team leaders. Is a good man, and I'm blessed to have served with him. Anyway, he served as one of the team leaders, and one of our times during some civil unrest, we talked about apocalypse type stuff, and we touched on the subject of clean water. And he's like, "I'll just boil water." Well, we lived in a massive metropolitan area in the Southwest, and what are you going to use to boil water? You're going to start tearing down apartment complex for wood, and you're going to cook it inside your apartment? Like you're going to make a fire inside your apartment to boil water? Like, that's just an easy answer because he knew, thankfully, that you can purify water by boiling it. But have you ever been camping and boiled water? You know how labor intensive it is, even out in a natural environment, in the forest. Keep in mind, we lived in an area that didn't have forest. We lived in the desert Southwest. So I'll just boil water. Yeah, maybe are you storing propane? Because how are you going to boil water in the suburbs or in a people hive? You get it? Same thing applies to rice and beans. How are you going to cook it? Right? Because that's an issue. Beans, a lot of times you have to soak maybe overnight and then cook. Right? You can't just cook it. You can't just cook a dried bean. You want to boil it for hours and hours and hours and hours, which is probably not good if the energy is a finite resource as well, right? You can't just store that. You can't just store the food. If you have to cook it, you have to store a way to cook the food. So that's a big downfall. Not to mention, if you're storing wheat or corn, you probably need to grind it. You could cook whole like feed corn, but you're probably going to be grinding it, and you're certainly almost going to be grinding wheat, labor intensive. Also, you have to cook it. Here's a simple solution, affordable, to solve that. Quick oats. Oats are good, they're nutritious, they're healthy. I would put them up against any of these other common survival foods, although they're not as commonly talked about. But oats. And a lot of times for the same price, you can get quick oats. They've been pre-cooked and then dehydrated, which means you don't have to cook them again. You can literally just add water and eat. And as far as nutrition goes, I'd rather have a bowl of oats than a bowl of beans and rice or a bowl of corn, right? Oats are pretty good nutrition as far as a grain goes. And again, quick oats, you can just add water. Sure, you can cook it and make a porridge if you want, but you don't have to. You can literally just add water. You don't have to cook it. You're going to need water anyway. You can just add water, and presto, you have survival rations. So quick oats, don't overlook those. I think they're kind of a hidden gem in the survival world. Nobody really talks about that, but if you're storing food and you may not have a way to actually prepare food, like if you have all this corn and rice in buckets, but you live in a people hive and the water goes out and you don't have enough water to drink, let alone to cook food, and you don't have a means of energy in which to cook food without burning the apartment complex down, but that's not a good solution, right? You get what I'm saying. Quick oats. Also along those lines, you may look at ramen noodles, right? There's nothing wrong with ramen. I mean, it's not the most nutritious, but if you're starving to death, it's not bad. You can certainly cook ramen. If you live somewhere warm, you could also just put it in a container and set it out in the sun. But even if you put it in cold water, you can make it that way. You can put it in a container of cold water in a, even in like an Nalgene water, a water bottle, dump the seasoning packet in there and just let it sit. And you can eat it. It might not be as good as a warm meal, but it's still good. And also you can eat it like a giant piece of toast. You can sprinkle the seasoning packet on top and eat it like a really dry cracker. Or you can eat them dry. You're obviously going to want water because it's going to make your palate pretty dry, but you can eat them like that. So you don't have to cook those either. So ramen noodles. And they're not expensive. And they come like with the pre-seasoned packets, right? So would you rather have a bowl of ramen noodles with the chili flavor, which is probably my favorite? Or would you rather have a non-seasoned, no flavor bowl of rice and beans? Right? The ramen starts looking pretty good. Even if you have beans and rice, maybe have a little bit of ramen so you can switch back and forth, or on days when you can't cook or don't want to cook. Ramen, right? It's a good, cheap, easy alternative. Now, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but there's also many other things. If you listen to my normal bio, you know that I'm a big-time hunter and things like that, and I like to forage. I was actually foraging today. My wife and I do also can and things like that, but that's kind of outside the scope of today. We're talking about food storage beyond beans. Another thing you really want to store, I think, is salt. Salt, literally, historically, I think, has been worth its weight in gold. And I'd say as far as actual value goes, it's worth more than gold. Your body needs salt. You will die without it. We don't really think of salt as very valuable today, but there was a time when Roman soldiers were paid in salt. The word salary comes from the word salt. That's how valuable it was. It's going to be very valuable again if we have some kind of giant disaster, because you need it to survive. You don't need gold to survive. Maybe trace amounts, but you're not eating gold. You get what I'm saying? You need salt. Also, if you do plan on doing any kind of hunting or foraging or canning or anything like that, you probably need salt for that as well if you're going to preserve food. What's worth more than just the salt itself. You only need a pinch or two of that a day probably, but if you want to preserve food, preserve meat, right? Salt is a thing. It's valuable, and it has historically been valuable for a reason. So, salt. And it's also really, really affordable today. You probably want most of your stuff in just regular bulk iodized salt. Yes, iodized salt. Iodine is also an important thing, and it usually costs the same, so why not get the iodine? Also, some kind of seasoned salt, especially if you get a good deal on it. You go somewhere, again, like Webstront store or somewhere else, like Dollar Store, if they have the giant packs of like taco seasoning or garlic salt. Maybe not the bulk of your salt, but a lot of that is mostly salt, but you also get a little bit of seasoning. So, those beans and rice might get a little bit bland at week 3 in the apocalypse. Maybe once every 2 days you switch it up and put in some taco seasoning or some garlic salt, right? You get the idea. But salt, don't overlook it. Super important. And you might say, I live near the ocean, I can get salt. But again, you go back to labor. yeah, you can certainly make salt from ocean water, right? It's a pretty simple process, but if you live somewhere like cold and or humid, and then you talk about labor, unless you live right on the beach, right, you have to transport that water back to where you're going, because you're probably not standing there with an armed guard for 4 days waiting for water to evaporate out of containers to get the salt, right? Because if you just leave it, somebody else is going to take it, or it's going to get knocked over, or a seagull is going to go to the bathroom in it, or whatever, right? So again, we go back to labor, time intensity. It's a lot easier to just have some salt, especially in their intermediate period. Maybe in the long term, yeah, you'll make salt from seawater or get it from the leaves of certain plants. But again, energy intensity, it would take a lot of energy to make a pound of salt that you can probably get at the grocery store today for under $1, or maybe a little bit over $1. I don't know what it is with inflation. Thankfully, we have some stored. I haven't bought any in quite a while. But yeah, salt, pretty important. Anyway, those are but a few of things you can do beyond the rice and beans. I don't want to draw this episode. I don't want to give a podcast to a standard 30 minutes if I can get the point across earlier. Tactical tip of the day comes from one of the listeners out of our Patreon chat. He's talking about how he cooks food on his engine on road trips. It makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense in a survival scenario if you're bugged in, because gasoline also is going to be a precious resource. You don't want to run your car for an hour and a half to cook food. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you're bugging out anyway, if you're traveling anyway and the car is turned on, yeah, why not salvage some of that otherwise wasted heat and cook some food? I've never done that, but he said that he's done it, and I've seen other people demonstrate it. So yeah, why not? I mean, put it in foil or whatever so you're not getting some nasty petroleum byproducts on your food. But yeah, engines get hot. If you know the right place to put it, and I'm not telling you where, but if you know the right places that's not going to interfere with the operation of the engine or get your food dirty, yeah, for sure. Good tactical tip. You can cook on an engine. And with that, your tactical verse of the day. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. You shall not pervert justice, you shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. You shall follow what is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Men, morals don't go out the window in an apocalypse, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. The point of survival shouldn't be just to continue to survive. It should be to grow closer to God. One day we'll all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Morals, right and wrong, truth and lies, that doesn't change. That's not as transient as culture or circumstance. Whatever life brings, remember one day we'll face judgment. And you, like myself, need a savior. And I think about that, because spiritual health and well-being is more important than the physical. The Bible says, be in health and prosper even as your soul prospers. Don't spend all your time focused on the physical and not on the soul, on the spirit, and that health. With that, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.